Hi, welcome to Myers ASMR. How are you doing today? Don't you love these? I call them bubble teas because of the tapioca jelly. This one is taro tea, and it comes from a very good restaurant called Sakura, Japan. I gotta learn how to make these. Well, let's get into today's story time. Let's talk about the history of jazz. Yippee! My father was very obsessed. I mean, there's just no other word. Obsessed with jazz, so it was pretty much forced upon us from birth. I still don't claim to understand jazz, but reading these stories is an attempt to understand such a big part of my world and my history and how I grew up, and to share this great music with others, with you. Let's talk about the Hot 5 and Hot 7. Armstrong returned to Chicago in 1925. His impact soon widened through groundbreaking ensemble recordings that showcased individual artists and his own personal appearances as a featured soloist with other orchestras. What ultimately turned small group jazz away from the polyphonic New Orleans ensemble and toward individual voices was the series of recordings Armstrong made under his own name for the OK label after he returned to Chicago. The featured ensemble still looked like Oliver's band and even included several of the same musicians, but the orientation was far more streamlined. Must know, the switch from acoustical to electric recording made it possible to more accurately capture the sounds of tuba and drums. Louis Armstrong's Hot 5 and Hot 7 played music arranged to feature the performers in individual solos. If the format revealed limitations of technique and invention in such older participants as Ori and Johnny Dodds, they elevated Armstrong, a musician who seemed to know no limits. His choruses dart and flow, his breaks crackle, as rippling glissandi and precisely placed high notes keep company with harmonic notions that look to the future. Rhythmically, Armstrong was even more daring, pushing and pulling against the more flowing 4/4 tempo implied by his solos, adding the gliding release of relaxation that was the necessary complement to earlier jazz's ragged tensions. Classic recordings. Several titles Armstrong recorded during this period became instant classics, including Cornet Chop Suey, Big Butter and Egg Man, Wild Man Blues, Potato Head Blues, and Struttin' with Some Barbecue. No Armstrong records in this period or later surpassed two 1928 interpretations of Oliver compositions. West End Blues, featuring a late version of the Hot Five, summarizes the range and complexity of Armstrong's art. An abstract and mercurial opening cadenza, straightforward and emotionally charged theme statement, and dramatic valedictory chorus in which a single sustained note explodes into whirls of energy. The duet, Weatherbird, is a seamless abstraction of ragtime structure, displaying the limits to which improvisers could stretch established forms. Both performances also showcase Pittsburgh native Earl Father Hines, whose exposure to Armstrong in Chicago led him to develop a similar linear fluency in his own solos. The connection was so strong that Hines became known for playing the piano trumpet style, a tribute to the melodic clarity of his right hand. The working reality. The great irony surrounding the Hot Five and Hot Seven recordings is that they in no way represent the music Armstrong played as a working musician. As Chicago's boldest and most charismatic soloist, he was in great demand for featured spots with the orchestras that performed in the city's theaters and ballrooms. These were not jazz bands per se, but popular ensembles that played the hit songs of the day as well as light classical material, and accompanied featured singers, dancers, and comedians. One band that employed Armstrong, Erskine Tate's Vendome Orchestra, played at the Vendome Cinema and provided accompaniment to silent films as well as stage show interludes, and where Armstrong took a featured turn along with several specialty acts. After the final screening, Armstrong would finish the night at the Sunset Cafe with another orchestra led by Carol Dickerson. Some of the speakeasies and nightclubs featured combos, with Jenny Dodds leading the small band at Kelly's Stables, and Hines working at the Apex Club with another of New Orleans' finest clarinetist, Jimmy Noon. Yet, even many of the clubs had switched to larger bands and floor shows by the late 1920s, and musicians who might blow informally at speakeasies on weeknights hoped to land more lucrative society and ballroom work on weekends. The roaring 20s image of Chicago jazz, with bootleggers like Al Capone arriving in clubs, locking the doors and then tipping band members generously as his requests were answered, was real enough, although by 1930 such scenes were more likely to take place in a ballroom, such as the Grand Terrace, where Hines now led an orchestra. Must know, Armstrong's Hot Five and Hot Seven recordings are as influential a series as any in jazz history. So, we're talking about the period from 1921 to 1940. The growth of jazz recording. Record companies realized that a public already existed for this new music. It was rooted in the southern black communities where the music first took shape, and in the black neighborhoods of northern cities that had been created by the Great Migration. But those roots were also expanding to other sectors of society through the contributions of white musicians such as bandleader Paul Whiteman and cornetist Bix Beiderbecke. Rare Records, as they were already labeled and would continue to be known for another 2 decades, had produced commercial successes since Mamie Smith released the first hit blues vocal, Crazy Blues, in 1920. Race Records featured raw sounds and lyrics, as well as a good share of salty humor at a time when the newfangled phenomena, blues and jazz, were still considered out of bounds in polite society. In many instances, the material was simplified for audiences that were presumed incapable of appreciating such fare as the Poet and Peasant Overture, which Armstrong was performing nightly with Erskine Tate. Paul Whiteman. As Armstrong's recordings gained influence, and as new companies entered the recording industry, other black musicians who worked in orchestras found opportunities to record in intimate surroundings. So did many white musicians, who found their working environment even more restrictive. Despite the inroads that jazz was making among white band leaders, even the hugely successful Paul Whiteman, the man portrayed as the king of jazz in a film of the period, only used jazz as one flavor in a mix that also included ballads, novelty songs, and light classics. Here's a picture of Mamie Smith, the first, if not the best, of the singers who popularized blues vocals in the 1920s. Isn't she lovely? The musicians that Whiteman and his competitors began hiring to play occasional solo choruses and breaks, and who otherwise worked even more anonymously in studio orchestras, also grew hungry for creative outlets. I have to take a sip of tea. Excuse me. The best of them, including cornetist Ernest Red Nichols, trombonist Irving Miff Mole, and Tommy Dorsey, and saxophonist Jimmy Dorsey, also began to organize small recording units in New York, often under fanciful names like the Charleston Chasers and the Redheads. Must know, part of Armstrong's genius was that he managed to transcend the limitations of common entertainments and make them occasions for art. White jazz in the 1920s. These early examples of white jazz featured smoother ensemble work than recordings made by either the New Orleans pioneers or Chicago's Austin High disciples, with a frequent emphasis on instruments other than horns. Joe Venuti's violin, Eddie Lang's guitar, Kenneth Red Norval's xylophone, suggesting hot chamber music. The absence of a dominant personality such as Armstrong on some of these performances lent a greater overall balance to the resulting music. Although one player did emerge who became a creative focal point, he played a cornet as Armstrong initially had, and during his far shorter life he exerted a similar fascination. Bix Beiderbecke. Bix Beiderbecke died a burnt-out alcoholic in 1931 at the age of 28, and the details of his life, as embellished in the 1938 Dorothy Baker novel Young Man with a Horn, came to epitomize the fate of the jazz age rebel to an extent exceeded only by F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tale of J. Gatsby. An Iowa native from a prosperous family, Beiderbecke was a brilliant but untrained musician who heard New Orleans music on the river boats that visited his hometown of Davenport. After making early Gannett recordings with the Wolverines, he sat in with Oliver and Armstrong in Chicago. Work in the Midwest with saxophonist Frankie Trumbauer and bandleader Jean Goldkette followed. Even then, more small group recordings in 1927 issued primarily under Trumbauer's name. Beiderbecke also recorded an original composition on piano, In a Mist, that employed harmonies commonly associated with contemporary European composers. Here's a picture of Leon Bix Beiderbecke. He is among jazz's first great soloists and tragic figures. Right here. Beiderbecke proved to be the perfect tragic icon, a raw genius who stunned his fellow musicians in one-shot recordings situations, yet aspired to create symphonies, and who drank himself to death out of frustration and lack of recognition. No doubt he was exposed to musical possibilities far different from those confronting Armstrong and the other black musical pioneers, whom Beiderbecke admired, but we remember him not because he transcended jazz, but because he brought out other possibilities within the music's orbit. Did you know, although he couldn't read music, Bix Beiderbecke spent 2 years as a featured soloist with Paul Whiteman? Beiderbecke's legacy, with his pure sound and knack for sustaining melodic invention, and in his more settled yet still surprising use of rhythm, Beiderbecke demonstrated that jazz could encompass profound personal expressions not drawn directly from African American experience. Black musicians, including Armstrong and Rex Stewart, one of Armstrong's successors in the Henderson Band, paid attention to Beiderbecke not because he sounded black, but because he drew from the common pool of jazz techniques in order to sound like himself. Cornetist Rex Stewart showed the influence of both Armstrong and Beiderbecke in his work with Fletcher Henderson and later Duke Ellington. Must know, Beiderbecke's records are evidence that jazz is both a language and an art form with universal appeal. Thank you so much for listening and watching. I got a lot out of this, and I hope you did too. Well, like and subscribe. Catch me in the next video, and may you find lasting happiness. Bye.